Welcome back, friends and comrades, to In the Meanwhile. I'm Marcus Harrison Green.
And I'm Nora Kenworthy. Marcus, we are just about at the tail end of our summer. But I don't know if you've noticed, but I've certainly noticed that this season felt a little less like Wet Hot American Summer and a little bit more like Parable of the Sower, if you know what I mean. Less Sandlot, more The Road.
It is certainly, I've felt that vibe as well, Nora, I must say. Sure seems like summer used to be a bit more carefree than checking the air quality index every single day and figuring out which loved ones are getting evacuated from a national disaster. My God, like it does make me nostalgic for the times when Jaws was the worst summer nightmare we could come up with. Now the nightly news is way more horrifying.
Yeah, remember when it was like one shark that we were scared of? Sorry. This episode took a turn for the dark very quickly. Apologies to our listeners.
When doesn't it, Nora?
Yeah,
when doesn't
well, fair. But it's true. I think it'd be easy to be so distracted by the political nightmares and Trump's epic blunders this summer that we forget the sort of bigger planetary picture that we're all living under.
Yes, forgive the interruption there, Nora. But for a moment, just to relish the many blunders of the summer.
Oh, sure.
So,
yes, I will give you
yeah.
that moment.
Yes, let's start with the polls. Trump has the lowest approval numbers ever, like since they started polling people. Like I'm talking about like time immemorial, and they keep dropping. Meanwhile, Democrats are turning out in record numbers and voting for progressive primary candidates like Abdul El Sayed, and Republican ballot measures are failing even in deeply red states. And did you also just see, Nora, that obviously as a senator, there's probably going to be a Republican senator that ultimately gets elected in Florida. But even there, a DSA candidate ended up winning the Democratic primary. So there you go.
Yeah. It's almost like what the New York Times keeps telling us about how progressive candidates are going to be our doom, like might not actually be reality. I don't know.
Interesting.
They try and make it so every day, though. But yeah, how about the courts? By my count, the Trump administration has lost a stunning 23 straight court cases in its attempt to seize voter rolls from states. I guess you got to give them points for persistence, probably persistence fueled by desperation.
That's the thing.
Trump also keeps losing his cases and his appeals against E. Jean Carroll, including from his very own stacked Supreme Court.
Well, also in the Supreme Court, I seem to recall some big losses on tariffs and birthright citizenship, which the president is still trying to overturn. But my personal favorite loss before it even started is the case against Olympic canoeer David Hearn, who was accused by the Trump administration of vandalizing their reflecting pool. So a judge dismissed that case faster than a teacher dismisses class on the last day.
I have to say, though, Marcus, my personal favorite and one that we definitely haven't given enough time to on this program is the Kennedy Center debacle. As listeners, I'm sure remember, Trump's name was ordered removed from the building after a judge rightly determined that only Congress could change the name. So soon after Trump's name had defaced that building, they had to start removing those same letters. But because Trump has the emotional regulation of a toddler on a bender, they had to raise tarps to cover the removal. And those tarps are still there, I think probably just to protect Trump's ego.
Yeah, it's like a twisted form of underdeveloped object permanence. Like, since he can't see it's gone, maybe I don't know, he still thinks like it's there. Whatever. But I'll say the bigger picture view here is that Trump has dug his heels in this summer on one issue after another that are wildly unpopular with voters and make him look like Scrooge McDuck with a vendetta against monuments. The Iran war, there's tariffs, the SAVE Act, Air Force One, turning DC into a gilded hellscape. As one Trump insider put it, he concentrates on the hobbies that distract from his terrible polling numbers about which he is in denial. And to that I say, no shit.
Yeah. Those are some weird fucking hobbies, though, Marcus.
That is true.
Like,
Very
has anyone tried offering him, like, shuffleboard or something? I don't know. Rich people are weird. Okay.
They're gonna
Uh,
rich, man. Rich people gonna rich, man. Anyway.
there's a saying in politics that campaigns are won or lost over the summer. If this summer is anything to go by, it sure isn't looking good. Um, I do wonder if we've done enough accounting of political blunders for this week's top of the show, Marcus. I know we could go on a lot longer than we have.
We certainly could. We could just make a whole podcast series of
We
it, to be
probably
honest with
should.
you.
Yeah.
But but I think you were trying to make a point earlier about not getting distracted by all the political theater.
Well, yeah, sort of. And we dove straight back into that rabbit hole
I mean,
joyfully,
it's
I will
hard
say.
not to. It's hard not to.
But that actually helps make my point. I think it would be easy to relish in these distractions and daily dramas, but there's been a mournful soundtrack to our summers that keeps getting louder and harder to ignore. And while the impacts of our climate crisis are certainly felt year round, at least to me, it feels like our summers are now punctuated by crisis after crisis, fires, floods, extreme heat. It's getting harder and harder to escape it, to distract ourselves from it, to ignore it.
Yeah, this summer fire spread across Europe with shocking intensity after an early and particularly relentless heat wave. But it wasn't just Europe. Fires raged across North America, Asia, Africa. 80 countries in total, 350 million acres burned. And I don't know, that's more than the land masses of France, Spain, and Germany combined, which is harrowing, quite frankly.
Jesus. Yeah. It's truly an incomprehensible scale of loss. But even as we struggle to understand it, we see it, we feel it, we suffer from it. I remember a few weeks ago at a family reunion, I just kept having conversations with one family member after another who were from all over and kept talking about the weeks of smoky skies that they'd experienced this summer. I know that's something we're pretty accustomed to in Seattle, but this year it enveloped the East Coast and states like Michigan. And the health harms are real. It's estimated that tens of thousands of deaths annually are linked to wildfire smoke. And
Yeah.
that's just the human deaths.
Yeah, it's difficult to make sense of these broader tragedies because of both their scale and our own sense of helplessness, right? It is so much easier to be shocked in the moment and, wish them away and then just quickly forget.
Which is why I think what we're sharing with you today is so important.
Mhm.
We're closing out this summer with a special mini-series on climate grief from Dr. Jennifer Atkinson called Facing It. Dr. Atkinson is a renowned expert on climate grief and the mental health effects of ecological loss. In her work, she explores why despair about climate change leaves so many people unable to respond to this existential threat.
Yeah, but as Dr. Atkinson argues, our grief is also the secret to unlocking our ability to respond and adapt. When we give ourselves permission to really recognize what is happening, to sit with it, to mourn it, we also begin developing the skills we need to move from despair to action. Grief and hope aren't mutually exclusive, and for many of us, grief may even be our best ally in an age of climate crisis.
So today, we're thrilled to be sharing with you the first 3 episodes of Dr. Atkinson's podcast, Facing It. Dr. Atkinson is teaching professor of environmental humanities at the University of Washington, Bothell. Her seminars on eco-grief and climate anxiety have been featured in numerous news outlets like the New York Times and NPR. She is the author of The Existential Toolkit for the Climate Crisis, How to Teach in a Burning World, and also Gardenland, Nature, Fantasy, and Everyday Practice. She holds a PhD from the University of Chicago.
Without further ado, here are selections from Dr. Atkinson's podcast series, Facing It.
I want to talk about eco-grief and climate depression. That sadness and loss we feel for our burning planet, for all the lost beauty, for wildlife that won't survive the upheavals to come, for devastated communities and places, and for the suffering that didn't have to happen. We usually talk about the external impacts of our climate crisis, damage to landscapes, to the atmosphere and oceans, even our physical health. But there's a whole landscape of damage we carry inside of us as well. Our mental health is intimately linked to the natural world, and living through an age defined by so much destruction of life is bound to mark us by invisible traumas. If we want to overcome the paralysis that's keeping us from responding like this is an emergency, if we want to take the next steps towards healing and action, we have to face up to that buried grief and anxiety for our planet. I know this isn't the kind of prescription you hear in political discussions or scientific recommendations for reducing carbon emissions. But for decades, those approaches have failed to move us to action because they don't address our climate crisis at the most basic human level. When I was growing up in a rural part of California, we would sometimes sleep outside on our deck in the summer, and the sound of crickets was so intense it felt like falling asleep in a bath of nature sounds. Sometimes an owl would softly call out from the trees overhead, and living that far from town put you in a thick, liquid darkness where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. But if you opened your eyes in the middle of the night, the stars and the Milky Way overhead were electric. I have so many memories of that place, and what stands out most aren't specific events, but simple images. Swimming in the creek with our dogs, the trees we climbed, clouds of white moths fluttering around the porch light, like when you shake a snow globe. The California countryside wasn't just a place where I lived, it was who I was, and it shaped everything I came to love about this wild, living planet. So a few years back, when a decade of mega droughts and extreme heat set off historical wildfires that ripped through California, it felt like a death in my family. I'd moved to Seattle 10 years earlier, so all I could do was watch helplessly on a screen while my childhood landscape turned to ashes. The forests where we used to play hide and seek were swallowed by flames, and fires spread so widely that smoke across the West Coast was visible to orbiting satellites. People less fortunate than our family lost their homes, and in some cases their lives. Survivors told stories of jumping into lakes and swimming pools, of flames licking at their heels as they ran to cars to escape. The animals in those burn zones couldn't give interviews of their own, but I couldn't shake the pictures in my head of their fur on fire and bodies turned to ashes. But even though the pain from that experience was more intense than any destruction of place I'd felt before, the basic feeling wasn't really new. I think for years we've all been experiencing a kind of unacknowledged grief for our planet. Every day brings heartbreaking news of mass extinctions and dying oceans, displaced communities, vanishing forests, collapsing glaciers. How can anyone absorb that without being shaken to the core? But we don't live in a culture that openly mourns those kinds of losses, and that makes it hard to really process their magnitude or personal impact. When I think about the conversations I've had about grief over the years, and the self-help books and support groups and rituals that give us collective ways to mourn, they're almost always for the loss of other people. And while we might be familiar with the stages of mourning after a human loved one dies, denial, guilt, anger, depression, and finally acceptance, we don't really have a language to describe the pain of witnessing the death of ecosystems and other species. At least, not until now. In the last few years, terms like environmental grief, eco-anxiety, climate depression, and pre-traumatic stress have crept into our vocabulary. And it's not just tree huggers and climate protesters using those terms. Mental health experts, including the American Psychological Association, have been churning out research linking climate change impacts to depression, post-traumatic stress, anxiety and sleep disorders, substance abuse, and even suicide. When you think about it, it shouldn't really surprise anyone. Farmers are losing livelihoods from drought. Megafires and superstorms have erased entire towns. People are being displaced across the world, while indigenous communities in the Arctic have lost hunting practices and ancestral ways of life as the ice melts away beneath them. And to make things worse, vulnerable and marginalized communities are suffering the heaviest emotional impacts of this climate chaos, since they already struggle with inadequate access to affordable shelter and safe drinking water, mental health and emergency services, and so many other forms of support. All of that makes it much harder to recover from a disaster, whether physically or emotionally. But the problem is more than just climate catastrophes and extreme weather events we see on the news. Long before I watched California go up in flames, my childhood landscape had already been changing in 1,000 subtle ways, as creeks dried up and new housing developments dimmed the stars and made the nights less quiet. We all have those stories of slow-moving changes in our daily lives. The gradual loss of bees and songbirds, dying trees along the road, fishing trips where you come home with less and less every year. The philosopher Glenn Albrecht coined a term to describe this experience where a familiar place starts to feel strange. He calls it solastalgia. It's similar to nostalgia, a longing for some time or place you can't go back to. But with solastalgia, that homesickness happens without ever leaving home. A couple years ago, when I started to adopt this vocabulary, it made it possible to talk more openly about environmental loss with students at the University of Washington. I knew they were feeling despair and anger too, but the absence of any clear language made it hard to put their fingers on it. When we brought up terms like eco-grief and climate depression and solastalgia, students got it immediately, like something invisible that had been following them around suddenly took shape and had a name. They said it described exactly what they felt as summer skies were dimmed with smoke and fewer hummingbirds came to their backyards. Hearing students talk openly about their climate distress motivated me to look for some new ways to help. And one day when a student confessed she was switching to another major because environmental studies was too depressing, I decided to offer a seminar where we could address the emotional toll head-on. I posted flyers around campus to advertise this new course on eco-grief and anxiety, and the day registration opened, every seat filled. A couple months later, local and national news outlets started reporting on our class. Letters poured in from readers nearby and around the world who were comforted at least to learn they weren't alone in feeling despair. Those messages came from grandparents and nurses, school kids and scientists and baristas. It wasn't just me. It wasn't just our students. Eco-grief was everywhere. That's what this podcast series is about. We're going to explore climate anxiety and eco-grief, and the way I've seen it affect scientists, climate strikers and students, communities on the front lines who've been directly affected, even people in denial. As it turns out, a big part of denial comes from unresolved grief, from the failure to recognize and mourn our losses. When we lose something of value, but then carry on with our lives like nothing's really changed, we block off our hearts and minds from the profound connections we share with the natural world. This isn't about surrendering to despair. That won't help anyone. But it's time to admit that we're not failing to act because we're too consumed with sadness. We're paralyzed from acting precisely because we refuse to feel. It's like being trapped in a state of emotional sleepwalking. But reconnecting with those painful insights can shake us back into a waking state so we can step up and act before more is lost. Sometimes in doing environmental work, you hear that we need to avoid negative emotions that could lead to despair, that we have to always focus on hope and action and the future. There's no doubt that expressing hope is important, But I think that exclusive approach is the symptom of a culture that automatically sees the dark parts of our psyche as dysfunctional. I thought about this a lot last year when I lost my dad to cancer. I got some good advice from people who knew about grief and loss firsthand, and no one said to push the pain aside and just forge ahead to focus on the positive. They reminded me to sit with those hard feelings, to be present with my pain and anger and whatever else rose to the surface in that process. When I felt like crying in the middle of the workday, that's what my heart needed to heal, and I should talk about it openly and seek support from others. The cultural wisdom of the ages and all our world religions know this. Grieving doesn't lead to endless suffering. It leads to healing and mental health. Why should our grief for the world be any different than the loss of a loved one? Maybe the courage to mourn is all the more urgent as we look toward our climate future, because this assault isn't like the death of a single person you can finally accept and move on from. Ecological loss will continue on some level, even if we take decisive action immediately. Grief is strength in these times. Burying our emotions might shield us for a while, but grief keeps us in contact with truth. And beneath everything, it opens our eyes to the profound love we feel for the fabric of life that's under threat. Grief is a direct expression of connection, a pain we could never feel if it weren't for the depth of our love. And more than cheerfulness or stoicism or more information, it is love that will move us to fight. No scientific report or technological innovation will ever match that kind of power. This is a podcast about climate change, so I already know what someone's going to say. Why are you talking about feelings when we should be focusing on science or practical solutions? I hear versions of this question a lot. Back in 2017, when I started teaching a seminar on climate grief, it set off a media storm that turned my life upside down for months because I wasn't sticking with the standard script for addressing scientific topics. I'd created the class to help college students navigate the emotional toll of ecological loss and develop strategies to stay engaged in climate work without burning out. When local and national news reported on it, most people were supportive, but there was also an intense backlash. The criticism fell into two camps. One line came from climate deniers who mocked the course as a joke and a textbook example of liberal indoctrination in today's universities. Internet trolls flooded the paper's comment section and filled my email and voicemail accounts with hateful responses. The University of Washington, where I teach, temporarily removed my phone number from its webpage to protect me from more harassment. I didn't care about being mocked myself, but I cringed at the hostility toward our students, who were called wimpy and coddled babies, told to grow up, and insulted as liberal snowflakes. One commenter asked, "Do the students roll out nap mats and curl up in the fetal position with their blankies and pacifiers while listening to her lectures?" Another proposed we rename the class Snowflakes 101, How to Make Any Issue Seem Like Armageddon While You Continue to Live in Your Mother's Basement. But there was a second line of accusations I took more seriously, which came from people who do support climate action and environmental protections. That group identified as allies, but argued that climate change is a serious problem demanding clear-headed solutions, and we should be focusing on facts and reason instead of feelings. There are dozens of reasons this thinking is deeply flawed and even detrimental to the climate movement's success in mobilizing public action. First is the assumption that reason and emotion are mutually exclusive. In many cases, these modes of response align with each other. Having an emotional response seems rational when you're facing an existential threat like the collapse of Earth's life support systems. What's irrational are messages to stay calm and maintain the status quo. Now that we find ourselves well into climate overtime, one could argue that it's dispassionate or measured responses that are unreasonable. As a student of mine put it, panic seems pretty logical when the house is on fire. But there's much more to this emotion versus reason dynamic when we talk about our climate crisis. Anger, hope, anxiety, and love are constantly shaping our perceptions of the world and can motivate us to act or shut down and retreat. So to better understand these dynamics, this episode takes up a very basic question. In facing today's climate challenge, why do emotions matter? Since humans first started using images and language to tell stories, they've enhanced their effect by appealing to our sense of fear, desire, sadness, and wonder. Even scientists use these techniques. Rachel Carson, the author of Silent Spring and one of the most influential scientists of the 20th century, exposed the deadly effects of overusing pesticides in the 1960s by filling her book with nightmarish imagery and passionate emotional appeals. And it worked. Silent Spring became an international bestseller and led to a nationwide ban on DDT, the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the launch of the modern environmental movement. I read Carson's book back in high school and vividly remember the horror I felt learning of suburban families doused with DDT, children with birth defects, and the near extinction of the bald eagle in North America. One passage on the effects of aerial pesticide spraying was double underlined, where Carson described a, quote, silent landscape that was deserted by all living things. I also circled language like a strange blight, an evil spell, and a shadow of death falling over American towns. This was not the writing of a standard scientific account. In fact, the famous opening chapter reads more like a Gothic novel or the script of a horror film, playing on readers' psyches by making us experience the agony of dying birds, the betrayal of discovering that familiar characters are actually killers, and the fear in learning of toxins hiding in our homes and gardens. To be clear, Carson was a painstaking researcher and based Silent Spring on years of meticulous data collection. But the chemical industry seized on the book's emotional tone to discredit it and launched personal attacks against Carson as a hyper-emotional bird lover, a hysterical woman, and an unstable spinster with an affinity for cats. In the end, those charges couldn't sway the public, and faith in the chemical industry was irreparably damaged. Carson boldly stood by both her scientific research and the manner in which she presented it. As she once said, "It is not half so important to know as to feel." In our current age of climate consequences, those words may have even greater meaning. Anyone following today's environmental news is bombarded with incomprehensible statistics and timescales that are hard to process on a cognitive level. When we hear that 1 million species are at risk of extinction, or that hundreds of millions of people could become climate refugees, or that the impacts of our action could play out for millennia, it's almost impossible for the human mind to process those numbers. How many of us can think in terms of 1 million? But we can all feel a sense of grief or outrage when confronted with that loss. Long after we learn of a family that's lost their home or see the image of a sea turtle strangled by fishing nets, what stays with us is the sense of anguish and tragedy, not the statistics used to represent them. There's another passage I remember from Silent Spring, and looking at my old copy, I found it underlined and marked with a folded page. It explained that insecticides were not a selective tool killing only the target species, but toxins that poisoned all life with which they came in contact. Residents in the Midwest had reported house cats dying agonizing deaths, and a meadowlark someone found that had lost the muscular coordination to fly or stand, but continued to beat its wings while lying on its side. But it was Carson's image of a poisoned squirrel that had burned itself into my memory. She wrote, "The head and neck were outstretched, and the mouth contained dirt, suggesting that the animal had been biting at the ground. Carson then closed with this question to readers. By acquiescing in an act that causes such suffering to a living creature, who among us is not diminished as a human being? I think this is why we need a vocabulary for talking about the emotional toll of ecological loss. Those feelings are already there, but we ignore their legitimacy by refusing to name them. Terms like eco-grief and climate anxiety help us conceptualize something that otherwise seems invisible. Understanding the emotional dimensions of climate change also gives us insight into what makes this crisis so unique. People with misgivings about the whole concept of climate despair have asked how it differs from any other form of chronic anxiety or depression. It's a fair question, since we all go through dark times when we lose a loved one or experience other hard chapters in life. But I think the sheer scale and complexity of our environmental crisis leaves people feeling overwhelmed in a unique way. Climate change isn't just one thing you can isolate, like sea level rise or melting glaciers. When you pull at any string in this issue, you find it tangled with everything else. That's why researchers characterize climate disruption as an all-encompassing threat that will affect every part of our lives. Public health, agriculture, inequality and racial injustice, military conflicts and interpersonal violence, the refugee crisis, disappearing wildlife, the survival of oceans and forests and coastal cities, mental health in the wake of disasters. That's why our climate paralysis is worse than many situations involving personal tragedies. When you're staring down an existential threat that's planetary in scale and whose consequences will likely play out for thousands of years, it's easy to feel like you're living in a bad dream where everyone around you is sleepwalking through the apocalypse. And for young people, there's also a deep sense of betrayal to wrestle with. The generation before them knew about the science, going back at least 30 years when NASA scientist Jim Hansen testified before Congress to warn the world about climate threats. But we didn't act. In fact, every year since then, carbon emissions have gone up. But taking emotions seriously not only helps us understand the fear and anxiety from climate change, it also provides insight into why we fight for our world in the first place. Nature is our home, and not just the home in which our bodies evolved, but also the birthplace of our primordial brains and earliest feelings. Our psychological makeup is rooted in those bonds with nature, developed during the Pleistocene epoch, and a vast body of research is now revealing how the human mind adapted itself to problems and experiences encountered during the 1,000,000+ years spent as hunter-gatherers. Evolutionary psychology shows how these interactions became hardwired responses over time. And so even though countless cultural factors influence us today, you still see that ancient relation between mind and environment expressed in human traits like our enjoyment of looking at bodies of water, the elevated mood we feel in green spaces or when we have a view of trees, in children's love of hiding and predisposition to climb trees, in our fascination with wild animals, and our instinctive fear of snakes and spiders. These feelings continue to exert a powerful influence, even in the age of smartphones and air travel. Which is hardly surprising when you remember that our modern era has lasted only a blink of a moment compared to the vast expanse of time we spent living in and being shaped by primordial environments. To put this in context, Michael McCarthy points out that we've been staring at screens for a single generation and living in cities for just a few. But we were farmers for 500 generations and hunter-gatherers for 50,000 generations or more. As he wrote, "We may have left the natural world, but the natural world has not left us." That's why Rachel Carson didn't just focus on the horror of our ecological assaults, but also the beauty and intricacies of nature, knowing that these would resonate with something deep inside her readers. As she once put it, the more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for destruction. Reigniting that sense of connection is always possible because it lives in the deepest part of our psyche. Perhaps tapping into those emotional bonds, both our love for the natural world and the grief we feel as it's diminished, perhaps that could offer our best chance to change course before more is lost. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot to learn from the statistics and formulas used to analyze our world, and we shouldn't discount their crucial role in sounding the alarm as the lines on climate graphs have taken a sharp turn and launched skyward like missiles. But nor should we discount the power of our emotional lives to convert love and wonder into action on behalf of nature. In feeling, there is ancient wisdom. Walt Whitman captured this truth generations ago in a poem describing his awe in gazing at the stars, an experience that no scientific equation could ever match. You might know the poem. Here's how it goes. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I sitting heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became tired and sick. Till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical, moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. The Persian poet Rumi once said, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." It's one of those sayings I'd typically dismiss as just another quote that gets printed on sympathy cards. But after 10 years of working on climate issues, those words have returned many times to make me rethink how we respond to this crisis. Every week when I walk into the classes I teach at the University of Washington, there's some new report to break your heart. Fires raging across Australia and the Amazon rainforest. Reports that bird populations have crashed by a third in North America since the 1970s. And warnings that half of all wildlife could vanish in coming years. New studies show that sea level rise will flood coastal areas more quickly and dramatically than previously predicted, and that drought, food shortages, armed conflict, and more severe climate disasters could be the norm by mid-century. Yet in the midst of all this tragedy, global carbon pollution keeps rising. If we're to have any chance of meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, emissions should be dropping sharply. But last year, they hit an all-time high, smashing the previous record, set just the year before. So it's not surprising that I see so much despair among today's college students. They tell me they don't want to have kids because they could grow up in an apocalyptic future. Some have trouble sleeping at night, or they feel betrayed by the previous generation that handed them this mess, and guilty for all the ways they've contributed themselves. And it's not just students suffering from climate grief. Scientists talk about falling into depression from researching dying coral reefs and disappearing wildlife. Unsuspecting tourists have found themselves fleeing megafires or watching Arctic landscapes melt away before their eyes. I know restaurant workers and video game developers who suffered chronic anxiety after the US pulled out of the climate agreement in Paris. And then there are all the communities on the front lines of this crisis who aren't just watching the world unravel from a distance. They're living it every day. But to make things harder, our culture doesn't acknowledge the pain of losing wild creatures or part of our natural world the way we do in acknowledging human loss. So those witnessing this destruction are often left to mourn in the shadows. This is what's known as disenfranchised grief, a sense of loss someone feels, but that society doesn't acknowledge. That lack of legitimacy only intensifies the pain and isolation. In response, support groups like the Good Grief Network have chapters springing up across the U.S. to help people cope, and climate psychology has become a new field as therapists see more patients with eco-anxiety. As a climate educator, I wanted to do my part as well, so I created a seminar that helps people navigate the emotional toll of environmental loss. Like anyone experiencing physical or emotional pain, students wanted relief from their distress. I wanted that too. But something unexpected happened along the way. I had always thought of grief as a bad thing, a dark state to avoid or overcome as quickly as possible. I thought that feeling grief was like giving in to a preventable illness, or that once it took hold, I might fall into a bottomless hole of despair. Like the students who signed up for my class, I was hoping to extinguish my grief for all this suffering. Then it dawned on me that maybe we were seeking solutions to the wrong problem. We all wanted to fix the way we felt so we could go back to feeling happy. But grief isn't something to be fixed, because it's not dysfunctional. It's a healthy and necessary process we have to undergo in order to heal. In fact, grief can be a valuable source of wisdom as we move into an uncertain climate future. I know this sounds controversial in a moment when environmentalists are urging us to focus on hope, but the two aren't mutually exclusive. And for many people, grief may be an even more powerful force for transformation. That's why Rumi's insight about light entering us through our wounds isn't just clever wordplay. Grief is one of the great unacknowledged paths to hope and compassion. Some argue that it may be our best ally in the age of climate crisis. This episode looks at 3 reasons I think they're right. First, grief isn't just one of many options for accepting loss. Grief is the process of accepting loss. I get why many people working towards sustainability want to sidestep emotional issues and push the public straight into action. The situation is urgent, and dwelling on our feelings can seem like an extravagance as the fires close in. But the problem is when we try to jump straight to the final step without first processing the emotional toll of all this lost beauty in life, we're bypassing the very insights that motivate us to save what we love. Ignoring ecological grief is like trying to rush through any great loss, a job, a home, someone you love, without pausing to acknowledge what you're leaving behind. In all those cases, we're not just losing something we once had, we're losing the future that many of us had counted on. We can't act creatively and honestly in this new reality if we still believe we're living in the old one. Most of us are stuck in a pre-climate change fantasy realm, clinging to delusions that our world in coming years will still be the world we imagined growing up. Denial isn't just a description for people who reject the science. It describes university professors like me, and scientists who devote their lives to studying climate change, and activists fighting to keep things from getting worse. We understand the problem intellectually, but don't live our lives as though we do. We accept the facts, but we haven't felt our way through what those facts mean, how our lives, how all lives will be undone in some way. We're like the person who knows a loved one is dead, but hasn't let that reality penetrate to their core, where it will reorganize all the ways they relate to the past and future, and determine all they'll have to let go of. In short, giving yourself over to grief is the difference between reciting a fact and knowing a truth. But even though all personal losses share this difficulty, not all grief is identical. Climate grief may be more complicated than other losses. For one, we can't find comfort in telling ourselves that what's happening is a necessary or inevitable part of the natural cycle. Unlike the death of individuals, ecological assault is preventable. Another difference is that our climate suffering doesn't happen a single time to a single person. It's an intergenerational legacy that will leave behind a diminished world to everyone not yet born. And third, while our loved ones may die of an illness we played no part in creating, with environmental loss we feel complicit, which adds more layers of guilt and denial. In the face of so much emotional complexity, even people who can openly grieve in other situations feel numb in response to climate disruption. Or they learn that staying detached feels safer. Climate activists have told me that's how they protect themselves and keep moving forward in the face of setbacks. I've gone through those phases too. But if we numb our sadness and pain, how can we still feel love and compassion as intensely as before? Our emotional lives can't be compartmentalized like that. When we deaden one sense, we diminish all the others as well. And the result is an impoverished experience of the world we want to save. The second way grief acts as our ally is by breaking down boundaries we've created between ourselves and other species, as well as other humans. We usually think of mourning as a private experience, but it can also be a radical political act. In our culture, there's a hierarchy of lives that matter and lives that don't. Some deaths receive elaborate mourning rituals and public tributes, while others are trivialized or ignored. Marginalized groups know how this absence of public grief dehumanizes them, which is why LGBTQ activists, people seeking justice for murdered Indigenous women, and Black Lives Matter all use public protests and vigils to demand that those deaths aren't made invisible. In the same way, when we openly grieve for the loss of other species, or forests, or rivers, we're asserting that non-human lives are also worthy of mourning, and refusing to accept their exclusion from human circles of compassion. In addition, the act of challenging boundaries between species transforms our personal perceptions. Keeping nature and humanity in separate categories prevents us from seeing our living planet as a network of kinship to which we belong. Grief calls us back to an awareness of those bonds. This makes it a restorative spiritual practice in its own right, as Douglas Burton Christie has argued. He wrote that the ability to mourn for the loss of other species is an expression of our sense of participation in and responsibility for the whole fabric of life. That's why we can't leave climate solutions to science and technology or policymakers alone. There's no technology we could invent that would fix our deeply ingrained habit of seeing the natural world as an object, as something detached from human lives. This brings us to the third and most powerful way that grief can act as an agent of transformation in the era of climate chaos. Beneath everything, grief is a sign of deep attachment and connection. You will not grieve for something you don't love. That's what grief is. It's the pain felt in losing something dear to you. Martine Prechtel once wrote that grief is praise because it is the natural way that love honors what it misses. So we shouldn't think of grief and love as opposites, but actually as two sides of the same coin. The artist Chris Jordan echoes that insight in claiming that when we try to be cheerful and suppress our grief for the world, we're also suppressing our love for it. Grief and love can be seen as inseparable twins, he wrote. When we hold grief at a distance, our love becomes inaccessible. And when we embrace grief, we reconnect with the essential aspect of our being that has gone missing. I want to close with a confession. The first few years I was teaching my seminar on climate grief, I didn't really know what I was doing. But in an emergency, our responsibility is to jump in and do our best, rather than standing on the sidelines because we're insecure about our lack of expertise. So despite feeling unqualified, I dove in. Then my dad died, and it pulled the rug out from underneath me. I'd never known grief like that before, and was struggling just to drag myself back into the classroom after his loss. But his death brought clarity to my work around climate change. For the first time, I really understood the purpose of what I'd been doing all along. It made me confront a question that countless others have faced in the wake of a painful loss. Would you choose, if you could, to extinguish the pain entirely? Would you abandon it like a bad habit or a bag of rotting fruit? Or would you hold it close to stay connected to the thing you loved and to keep you mindful of the relations that give your life meaning? I choose to keep the pain for my father. Even though it hurts like hell, snuffing it out would dishonor my love for him. Nor could I do so even if I wanted. Our love isn't some flimsy birthday candle put out by a draft from the window. I don't want it to rage out of control and consume me, but still, I need to feel the low, steady smoldering of sadness holding its place, drawing me back after a spell of forgetfulness to the memory of his scarred hands and gentle voice. As time marches on, the ache I carry reminds me to speak of my father to others, to honor what he taught me, to treasure the small items I took from his room the morning he died: a book, a pin, a poem transcribed by hand. That's what I came to understand about environmental loss as well. The persistent grief we feel for our world reminds us to honor the sanctity of life wherever we find it, to hold even tighter to our values, and to resist with all we have any act that threatens to extinguish the life that remains.
Marcus, I'm really thrilled to be able to have Jennifer's voice on this podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I've thought a lot over the last couple of years about what we lose when we fail to mourn things, and the kinds of denial that it causes for us socially. I think we really saw that during COVID, for example. And I think the idea that there's power in grief and there's power in loss and outrage is a really, really cool thing to think about, not just with climate grief, but with all kinds of grief that we experience in our communities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I definitely agree. It's I hope listeners took and absorbed the lessons from this podcast, and I do also hope that even though this it's not our podcast, I do hope that they continue to follow Dr. Atkinson's work, because it's very necessary.
Yeah, it's super cool.
Yeah. Well, shall we get into our joys?
Let's do some joy. Yeah.
We need it. My goodness, we need it. Yeah, I guess I'll go first, Nora.
Okay.
I will say, I think for me, it's what I found is just sort of with, we talk so often about, what's going on in life and so forth, and our current sort of state of society. And what I've noticed is seeing more and more people, and maybe it's just like people get more reflective towards the end of summer. But I've seen more and more people across generations just have perspective sort of about life, in the sense of it's not that they're checking out of the news or some of the terrible things that are going on, but I think maybe what this last year and a half or 4 years or 5 years has done is very much give people a sense of balance and measurement. And, our last few podcast episodes have been about, really collective agency, if you will, with folks. And so I see that as, something that is definitely I think in the zeitgeist these
Hmm.
days, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that's my joy. And I know it's just anecdotal, but in just talking to people who are quote unquote normies, right? I think they've been able to peer through the matrix, if you will, about um, not sort of accepting the doom and the gloom and the
Yeah.
despair, but realizing that yes, there is something that can be done about it, and even at very micro levels. So
Yeah.
yeah,
I'm even seeing that in all of our conversations these days, like kind of like in the public frame conversations around like attention and where we give our attention. I was
yeah,
at an Ani DeFranco concert earlier this summer, and she talked about the power of like what we give attention to and how toxic it is, how much attention we've paid to Trump, and just like the power of us looking away. And I really do see people starting to kind of like check in with that in some really interesting ways.
yeah, yeah. There is. I will say, like, I think to your point about just attention and focus, like, I think these things are being reclaimed,
Mm, yeah,
by people, and
yeah,
I think that is a good thing because in order for us to move forward in this world and change and design the world, if you will, that we
mm,
want, it's going to take a lot of time and attention, and those are things that have been in short supply recently for a lot of
yeah,
people. So
yeah.
yeah.
Well, speaking of attention, mine is about something that I've used to distract myself this summer. Summer is usually kind of like intensive writing and reading time
Hmm.
for professors. um, but I try and always give myself permission to like delve into like one pleasure read or pleasure watch,
As
like
you should.
lengthy, yes, over the summer. And
So
this
you
summer, mine was on the recommendation of my husband. Usually, we do not read any of the same stuff, but he said you got to check out this Dungeon Crawler Carl book series, and
Okay,
they're super long.
okay. Yeah,
Basically, the premise is like a guy who gets stuck in a video game run by aliens, and I really didn't think I was going to like this at all.
yeah. The premise
It's
was not quite
The
appealing
premise
to
was like not my vibe. Yeah,
you?
it is so great. It's like escapist but dark and funny all at the same time.
Mm,
It's These books are super long, so I have been able to like dwell in them all summer long. Um,
yes.
but in the end, I think what this book series is about is, I think what it's saying something. I don't know if that's what it's entirely about, but I think it's really
Yeah.
trying to say something about humans and what carries us through incredibly hard
Mm,
times. And it's this like celebration of our endurance and our sick sense of humor that we have
yeah.
about,
Yes, yes.
what helps us laugh when even the darkest situations are consuming us. It's also a celebration of like our idiosyncrasies and
Mm,
kind of our like
yeah.
fuck you make me energy.
Yeah, yeah.
um and ultimately about our capacity to keep fighting even against these incredibly incomprehensibly impossible odds.
Mm,
Carl, the main character in the series, has a mantra like "You will not break me," often
mm.
followed by a like "fuck you all"
Yes.
statement. But I think like we could use more of that attitude these days, and I think it's a celebration of that kind of like human spirit, as messed up as it is. And so I've really enjoyed it. I know a lot of other people have enjoyed it, so this is probably not new to a lot of our listeners, but it's been a serious source of joy this summer.
That's awesome. Well, hey, I'm all for the joys of reading, particularly in our quote unquote post literate society that we're in.
Yeah, same.
Anyway. Well, well, hey, I frequently use my library card, and so that is now in my queue, Nora. So thank
Yeah,
you
and
for.
it seems like the Seattle Library has unlimited copies, so,
Oh, well
I've
then.
been able to get the entire series, when I
Okay.
wanted it, which is like that's very special for me on Libby.
And shout out to SPL as well. Shout out
Yeah.
to SPL.
Um,
Well, shall we on that note, shall we bid adieu to our listeners today?
yes, let's do it. So, if your summer, like mine, had the emotional valence of the Iron Rattler or the Thunderbolt roller coasters, and not in a fun way, um, you are not alone. But maybe if the planet is mad as hell, we should be too.
Yeah, and huge thanks to Dr. Jennifer Atkinson for letting us host parts of her series Facing It this week and showing us that climate despondency is neither helpful nor inevitable. And this podcast is not inevitable either. As an independent, ad free podcast, we're sustained by listeners who believe conversations like this one matter. You can help Keep them going with a one-time gift or a monthly contribution at inthemeanwhilepodcast.com.
Everlasting thanks as well to our producer, Jessica Partnow, who somehow translates the ramblings of our existential dread into quality content each week. Thanks as well to Ahamaluo, whose music gives us all the break we need from both the news and the sound of our own psyches circling the drain.
Oh, yeah. Please make sure to follow In the Meanwhile on all your favorite podcast platforms. You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads, at least until their parent companies are sued into oblivion. We're on the radio Wednesdays at 5 p.m. on KBRU, and new episodes drop every single Friday.
Until then, let's keep counting our wins, keep checking on our people, and get real with each other about what we're up against. The only way out has always been through.
Take care of yourselves and each other, and until next time, we'll see you in the meanwhile.